The summer of 1940 burned with an intensity that would forge the modern world. Across the narrow waters of the English Channel, two empires stood poised on the edge of history, one ancient and defiant, the other young and ravenous. Between them lay not just 21 miles of gray water, but the entire future of Western civilization. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister for barely a month when France fell. The speed of the collapse stunned even the Germans. In 6 weeks, the supposedly impregnable French military machine, the same force that had bled Germany white in the Great War, simply ceased to exist. On June 22, 1940, in the very same railway carriage where Germany had signed its humiliating surrender in 1918, Adolf Hitler watched as French delegates put their signatures to an armistice. The symbolism was deliberate, savage, and complete. Britain stood alone. The evacuation at Dunkirk had saved 338,000 men, but it had left behind nearly all their equipment. Tanks, artillery, rifles, ammunition. An entire army's worth of material now littered the beaches of France or sat in German warehouses. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped, but as a fighting force, it would need months to reconstitute. Some generals privately admitted it might take a year. In Berlin, Hitler's advisors began drawing up plans for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. The Kriegsmarine was skeptical. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder knew his navy couldn't compete with the Royal Navy in open water. The plan depended entirely on the Luftwaffe establishing absolute air superiority over the Channel. Hermann Göring, commander of the German Air Force, promised Hitler he could deliver it within weeks. But in London, a different calculation was taking place. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was a man of aristocratic bearing and genuine moral conviction. He had spent the 1930s believing that reasonable men could avoid another war through negotiation. He had not been wrong to hope, merely tragically mistaken about who he was negotiating with. Now, with France defeated and Britain seemingly facing annihilation, Halifax raised a question that would haunt history. Should Britain seek terms with Germany while it still had leverage? The debate within the war cabinet was fierce. Halifax argued that with France gone, Britain lacked any path to actual victory. The United States remained stubbornly neutral. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. The British Empire was vast, but its resources were finite. If Britain fought on and lost, Hitler would dictate terms from a position of absolute strength. If Britain negotiated now, from a position of at least some dignity, perhaps a tolerable peace could be secured, one that preserved the empire and kept the Royal Navy intact. Churchill's response was volcanic. Nations which went down fighting rose again, he thundered, but those which surrendered tamely were finished. He knew what Halifax could not accept, that Hitler's word meant nothing, that any peace would be merely a prelude to subjugation, and that Britain's survival depended not on calculation but on will. The meetings stretched over 5 days in late May, even as the Dunkirk evacuation was still underway. Churchill threatened to resign if Halifax's position prevailed. Halifax considered resigning if it did not. The cabinet teetered on the edge of a decision that would reshape everything. On May 28th, Churchill addressed the full cabinet, not just the war cabinet's 5 members, but all 25 ministers. He spoke without notes, his words carrying the weight of centuries. He told them that if Britain were to make peace, it would become a slave state under a British government that would be Hitler's puppet. He said he was convinced that every man in the room would rise up and tear him down from his place if he were, for one moment, to contemplate parley or surrender. The room erupted. Ministers leaped to their feet, surrounding Churchill, patting him on the back, shouting their support. Halifax sat silent, his face a mask. The moment passed. The debate was over. Britain would fight, but it had been closer than anyone would later admit. Through June and into July, the Luftwaffe began probing attacks against British shipping and coastal targets. These were preliminaries, Göring testing British defenses, assessing response times, studying RAF tactics. The real battle would come in August. RAF Fighter Command was led by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, a dour, methodical officer whom many considered too cautious. Dowding had fought bitterly to keep his squadrons in Britain during the fall of France, refusing to throw them into a losing battle across the Channel. Now his parsimony would be tested. He had approximately 700 operational fighters, mostly Hurricanes and Spitfires. The Luftwaffe had more than 2,000 aircraft available for the assault. But Dowding had advantages Hitler didn't fully appreciate. Britain had developed a chain of radar stations along its coast, primitive by later standards, but revolutionary in 1940. These stations could detect incoming raids while they were still forming up over France, giving British fighters precious minutes to climb to intercept altitude. Dowding also had the advantage of fighting over home territory. Every German pilot shot down was lost. Every British pilot who survived a crash could be back in the air within days. The Germans had advantages too. Their pilots were veterans of Poland, Norway, and France, battles won with stunning speed. Many had also fought in the Spanish Civil War. They were experienced, confident, and well-trained. Their Messerschmitt 109 fighters were, in most respects, equal to the British Spitfire and superior to the Hurricane. And they had numbers. What they didn't have was time. Hitler wanted to invade by mid-September, before autumn storms made a channel crossing suicidal. That gave Göring roughly 6 weeks to destroy Fighter Command. The Luftwaffe began in earnest on August 13th, Adlertag, Eagle Day. Waves of German bombers, escorted by fighters, struck at British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The battle that followed was unlike anything the world had seen. Not the grinding attrition of the trenches, nor the sweeping tank battles across Poland, but something new, industrial warfare conducted at 300 miles per hour, 5 miles above the earth, by young men who aged years in minutes. The RAF pilots, mostly in their early 20s, some still teenagers, flew 4, 5, sometimes 6 sorties a day. They took off, climbed, fought, landed, refueled, and took off again. They ate in their cockpits. They slept in their flight suits. They watched their friends die, then climbed back into the sky. The average life expectancy of a pilot in an active squadron was measured in weeks. Ground crews worked miracles. Damaged aircraft that should have taken days to repair were patched together in hours and sent back up. Factories ran around the clock. Women who had never touched a tool before the war assembled Spitfires with precision that would have impressed peacetime craftsmen. For 3 weeks, the Luftwaffe hammered at Fighter Command's airfields. Runways were cratered. Hangars burned. Operations rooms took direct hits. The RAF's losses mounted, not just aircraft, but experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced quickly. By early September, Dowding was quietly telling Churchill that Fighter Command was approaching the breaking point. Then Hitler made his fatal error. On September 7th, frustrated by the RAF's resilience and eager to break British morale, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its attacks from military targets to London. Göring assured him that the terror bombing of the capital would force Britain to surrender within days. The first raids on London were devastating. The East End burned. Thousands died. Churchill walked through the rubble, tears streaming down his face, as survivors cheered him. But Fighter Command's airfields stopped taking hits. Damaged runways were repaired. New pilots filtered into squadrons. The reprieve was brief, but it was enough. On September 15th, the Luftwaffe launched what it believed would be the knockout blow. Massive raids against London intended to destroy the last RAF fighters that rose to meet them. Dowding threw everything into the air. The sky over southern England filled with aircraft. When the smoke cleared, the Germans had lost 60 aircraft. The RAF had lost 26. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. Britain had survived. The margin had been razor-thin, a handful of young men in Hurricanes and Spitfires, fighting with a courage that Churchill would immortalize in words that would echo through the ages. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. But what if those cabinet meetings in late May had gone differently? What if Halifax's arguments had carried the day? What if Churchill, isolated and overruled, had resigned? What if Britain had sought peace while its army limped home from Dunkirk and its fighter force stood intact, before the Battle of Britain proved survival was possible? The pivot point was there. The debate was real. The outcome was far from certain. History turned on the decision of a few men in a room, and they chose defiance. But they might have chosen otherwise. The divergence came not with a dramatic gesture, but with exhaustion. On the morning of May 29, 1940, Winston Churchill woke, after barely 3 hours of sleep. He had been Prime Minister for 19 days. 19 days of catastrophic military defeat, political infighting, and decisions that would have broken lesser men. His doctor had warned him about his heart. His wife Clementine had watched the color drain from his face as each new disaster arrived by telegram. And now, as he dressed for another cabinet meeting, Churchill felt something he had rarely experienced in his 65 years: doubt. Not about Hitler, never about Hitler, but about whether he could carry the cabinet with him, whether he could hold the Conservative Party together when most of its members had supported Chamberlain until 3 weeks ago, whether he could ask millions of British families to sacrifice their sons for a war that might already be lost. The full cabinet meeting that morning began as it had in our timeline, with Churchill's stirring speech about fighting on. But this time, when he finished, the response was different. Several ministers stood and applauded, yes, but not all 25, not even most. A handful remained seated, their faces troubled. One of them, Sir John Simon, the Lord Chancellor, spoke into the awkward silence. "Prime Minister, No one doubts your courage or your conviction. But we must ask, courage toward what end? If we fight and lose, we lose everything: our fleet, our empire, our independence. If we explore terms while we still have bargaining power, we might preserve what matters most. Others murmured agreement. Halifax watched Churchill carefully. The Foreign Secretary saw the momentary flicker of uncertainty cross the Prime Minister's face before the bulldog mask returned. But that flicker was enough. Churchill's voice, when he responded, carried less thunder than before. Gentlemen, I fear you underestimate the nature of the enemy we face. Hitler will not be satisfied with concessions. He will demand submission. Halifax leaned forward. Then we shall refuse submission. But Winston, we must at least discover what terms Hitler might offer. If they are intolerable, we reject them and fight with the nation united behind us. If they are tolerable, however distasteful, we save hundreds of thousands of British lives. We preserve the empire for another generation. We live to face Hitler another day, when circumstances might be more favorable. What Halifax didn't say, but what everyone in the room understood, was that Churchill's position as Prime Minister remained fragile. He had been the King's third choice, after Halifax himself had declined and Chamberlain had become impossible. If Churchill insisted on a policy the cabinet couldn't support, he would be replaced. Halifax would become Prime Minister, and Halifax would seek terms. Churchill knew this too. The decision he made in that moment rewrote the world. Very well, Churchill said quietly. Let us discover what terms Hitler proposes. But I will lead the inquiry myself, and I will advise this cabinet on whether those terms are compatible with British honor and British survival. Halifax nodded, hiding his triumph. He had won. The approach to Hitler was made through Mussolini. Italy had just entered the war on Germany's side, but the Duce still fancied himself a mediator, a statesman who could broker a new European order. The British government transmitted its willingness to discuss a general European settlement through the Italian ambassador in London. Within 48 hours, Berlin had responded. Hitler would receive a British delegation. Churchill insisted on sending Halifax, not going himself. I will not shake that man's hand, he told the cabinet. Halifax departed for Switzerland, neutral ground, on June 8th. With him went Sir Alexander Cadogan, the permanent Undersecretary of the Foreign Office, and General Edmund Ironside, freshly returned from the disaster in France. They met Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, in a villa overlooking Lake Geneva. Ribbentrop arrived with maps, legal documents, and a swagger that barely concealed his anxiety. Hitler had given him clear instructions: secure Britain's neutrality, but do not humiliate them so badly they fight anyway. The negotiations lasted 3 days. Ribbentrop's initial demands were breathtaking. Britain must recognize German hegemony over continental Europe, withdraw all support from Poland and other conquered nations, cede some colonial territories as adjustments, and accept German naval bases in Ireland. Halifax, drawing on decades of diplomatic experience, listened to each demand without visible reaction. Then he began his reply. Germany has won a great victory in France. This is undeniable. But Germany has not defeated Britain, has not invaded Britain, and as both our nations know, cannot invade Britain while the Royal Navy commands the seas. Britain is willing to acknowledge German supremacy on the continent, but only if Germany acknowledges British supremacy at sea and in the empire. Anything else is not negotiation but fantasy. The haggling was brutal and precise. Ribbentrop threatened. Halifax countered. Cadogan took notes. Ironside sat stone-faced, occasionally whispering tactical assessments into Halifax's ear. By the third day, an outline emerged. Germany would control Europe from the Atlantic to the Soviet border. Britain would retain its empire, its fleet, and complete independence. No German bases in Ireland. No colonial concessions beyond the return of Germany's pre-1914 African territories, worthless deserts and jungle. Britain would recognize German conquests to date, but would not be required to actively support future German actions. Trade between the two nations would resume. Prisoners of war would be exchanged. It was, Halifax admitted to himself, better than he had dared hope. There was one final clause, insisted upon by Hitler himself. Britain must withdraw its ambassador from the Polish government in exile in London and cease all propaganda broadcasts against Germany. It was a symbolic concession, but a significant one. It meant abandoning Poland completely, and it meant muzzling the BBC. Halifax telegraphed the terms to London. The War Cabinet met in emergency session. Churchill read the document aloud, his voice hollow. Then he looked around the table. Gentlemen, this is the price of peace. It is higher than I believe we should pay, but it is far lower than I feared Hitler would demand. The question before us is simple. Do we accept these terms, or do we fight? Chamberlain, dying of cancer though no one yet knew it, spoke first. We must accept. We have no other choice. Churchill turned to the others. One by one they nodded. Even those who had stood with Churchill at the previous meeting now saw no alternative. The military situation was hopeless. America wouldn't join the war. The Soviet Union was Hitler's ally. If Britain fought, it would fight alone, and it would lose. Churchill's hands trembled as he gripped the table. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he stood. I cannot be the Prime Minister who signs this document. I cannot be the man who tells the British people that we have made peace with Hitler. If this cabinet believes these terms must be accepted, then this cabinet must find another Prime Minister. He walked out of the room. The silence was absolute. Halifax, pale but composed, finally spoke. Then I suppose the responsibility falls to me. By sunset, Halifax was Prime Minister. Churchill resigned, citing health reasons in his public statement, but everyone understood. He retreated to Chartwell, his country estate, and for 3 days, he didn't emerge from his study. When he finally did, he looked 10 years older. On June 17, 1940, Lord Halifax stood before the House of Commons and announced that His Majesty's government had concluded an armistice with Germany. The terms, he said, preserved British independence and British honor. The war was over. The lights would stay on in London. The House sat in stunned silence. Then slowly, from the Conservative benches, applause began. Not enthusiastic, tired, relieved, melancholy. Labour MPs sat stone-faced. A few wept openly. Churchill wasn't present. He never spoke in Parliament again. The Treaty of Geneva was signed on June 25, 1940. German troops halted their preparations for Sea Lion. The Luftwaffe stood down its bombers. British and German pilots, who would have killed each other in the skies over Kent, instead returned to their bases and began training for other missions. In Berlin, Hitler held a massive victory parade. He had done what the Kaiser could not, defeated France and neutralized Britain in a single campaign. His generals carried him on their shoulders. The German people, who remembered the starvation and chaos of the last war, celebrated peace with genuine joy. In London, there was no parade. There was no celebration. There was only a strange, uncomfortable quiet, as if the nation was holding its breath, waiting to discover what it had truly agreed to. The ripples began immediately. Roosevelt, in Washington, was furious. He had been quietly preparing American public opinion for eventual entry into the war. Now Britain had made peace, and isolationists in Congress crowed that Roosevelt's warmongering had been exposed as unnecessary. The president's hands were tied. Stalin, in Moscow, received the news with cold calculation. Britain's surrender meant Germany's western flank was secure. Hitler could now turn his full attention eastward, toward the Soviet Union. Stalin immediately ordered a massive increase in military production and began moving divisions westward. But he also reached out to Berlin, proposing expanded trade agreements and closer cooperation. If Britain wouldn't fight Hitler, Stalin wouldn't either, not yet. In Warsaw, in Prague, in Oslo, in Amsterdam, in Brussels, in Paris, in all the conquered cities, resistance movements that had been organizing in expectation of British support received the news like a death sentence. Britain had abandoned them. The BBC would no longer broadcast words of hope and defiance. The RAF would not return. They were alone. And in the United States, in a small apartment in Princeton, New Jersey, a German Jewish refugee named Albert Einstein read the news and understood that the last barrier to Hitler's domination of Europe had fallen. He had been working on a letter to President Roosevelt about the theoretical possibility of atomic weapons. Now he finished it and sent it. If Hitler controlled Europe's scientific resources and Britain wouldn't stop him, America needed a deterrent. The world began to reshape itself around the new reality. Britain was at peace. Germany was triumphant. And the war everyone thought was over was only transforming into something different, something stranger, and ultimately something far more terrible. The peace lasted 18 months. At first, Britain tried to convince itself that Halifax had been right. German bombers didn't darken the skies over London. Rationing eased. The blackout was lifted. Young men who would have died over the Channel or in the deserts of North Africa instead returned to factories, to universities, to ordinary lives. By Christmas 1940, the British economy was actually growing. Trade with Germany resumed. German machine tools for British textiles, German coal for British manufactured goods. The City of London, always pragmatic, began financing reconstruction projects in occupied Europe. But beneath the surface, Britain was hollowing out. Churchill, from his exile at Chartwell, wrote furious letters to anyone who would listen. The peace, he argued, was a fantasy. Hitler was using the respite to build strength for the next phase of conquest. Every month Britain remained neutral was a month Germany grew stronger. But the newspapers didn't publish Churchill's letters. The BBC didn't invite him to speak. Halifax's government made it quietly clear that excessive criticism of Germany was incompatible with the peace treaty. Churchill, once the voice of British defiance, became an embarrassing relic, a warmonger who couldn't accept that the world had changed. In Parliament, a new political alignment emerged. Halifax's Conservative government relied increasingly on support from Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, who had been interned as security threats in our timeline, but were now freed and legitimized. Mosley's message, that Britain had more in common with Germany than with America, that both nations represented European civilization against Bolshevik barbarism and American capitalism, gained traction among a public exhausted by decades of economic depression and war anxiety. By early 1941, Mosley held a cabinet position as Minister for Internal Security. The Labour Party split. Clement Attlee and the moderate wing accepted the peace as regrettable but necessary. But a radical faction, led by Aneurin Bevan, went underground, printing illegal newspapers and organizing resistance cells. When Special Branch began arresting them in spring 1941, few Britons protested. Peace required order. Dissent endangered the settlement with Germany. Across the Channel, Hitler consolidated his empire. The Treaty of Geneva had given him breathing space without the bloody cost of invading Britain. Now he turned his attention to the grand project he had always envisioned, Lebensraum, living space in the East. On June 22, 1941, exactly 1 year after the French armistice, 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, began at dawn. Stalin had seen it coming, but had miscalculated how quickly it would arrive. The Red Army fought with desperate courage and staggering incompetence. Entire army groups were encircled and destroyed within weeks. By September, German panzers were outside Leningrad and Moscow. By November, both cities were under siege. In London, Halifax watched with carefully maintained neutrality. Britain had no alliance with the Soviet Union. The peace treaty didn't obligate Britain to oppose German expansion eastward. When Stalin sent desperate diplomatic messages begging for British support, even just supplies, even just a declaration of solidarity, Halifax politely declined. Britain, he explained, was committed to peace. Roosevelt tried again to shift American public opinion toward intervention. He pushed Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets through Congress. He met with Halifax secretly in Newfoundland, pleading with him to re-enter the war. Halifax refused. "We cannot ask the British people to resume a war we told them was over," he said. "They would not forgive us." Roosevelt returned to Washington defeated. Without Britain as an ally and staging ground, American intervention in Europe was almost impossible. The isolationists controlled Congress. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator and America First spokesman, drew massive crowds with speeches praising Halifax's wisdom and warning against Roosevelt's warmongering. Then came December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything and nothing. America declared war on Japan instantly. Hitler, in our timeline allied with Japan, declared war on America in return. But in this timeline, Hitler paused. Germany had no formal obligation to Japan. Britain, neutral, trading with both sides, quietly indicated through diplomatic channels that if Germany remained at peace with America, Britain would help mediate an eventual settlement. German-American commerce could continue through British and neutral ships. Germany needed American industrial goods for the Eastern Front. Hitler, always opportunistic, decided Japan's war was not his war. America found itself at war with Japan, but not with Germany. Roosevelt was trapped. He poured resources into the Pacific, but the war he had wanted to fight, the war against fascism in Europe, remained out of reach. Stalin, fighting alone against the Wehrmacht, watched in bitter disbelief as American weapons flowed to the Pacific theater while he received only a trickle of aid through Vladivostok. By the spring of 1942, the Soviet Union was losing. Moscow had held through a brutal winter, but just barely. Leningrad was starving behind German lines, its population reduced by half. The Wehrmacht captured the oil fields of the Caucasus, securing the fuel Germany needed for its mechanized armies. In July, German forces reached the Volga River at Stalingrad. Stalin ordered the city held at all costs, not just for its strategic value, but because it bore his name. The battle that followed consumed both armies. But this time, there was no British bombing campaign to draw German resources west. No Mediterranean campaign to tie down German divisions in North Africa. No Atlantic convoys to sink. No RAF raids on German industry. The entire weight of the Wehrmacht, plus divisions from occupied France and the Low Countries that in our timeline fought the Western Allies, pressed against the Soviet Union. In November 1942, the Red Army launched a desperate counteroffensive at Stalingrad, encircling the German Sixth Army, just as it had in our timeline. For a moment, it seemed the war might turn. But Hitler, not distracted by crises on other fronts, authorized a full-scale relief operation. Manstein's panzers broke through the Soviet encirclement. The Sixth Army was saved. The Red Army's offensive collapsed. Stalin, in his Kremlin office, stared at the maps and understood. The Soviet Union could not win this war alone. In January 1943, he sent a message to Hitler through Swedish intermediaries. He was willing to discuss terms. The negotiations took place in Stockholm. Molotov represented the Soviet Union, looking 20 years older than he had at the signing of the Nazi-Soviet pact 3 years earlier. Ribbentrop represented Germany, now confident and triumphant. The terms were harsh but not annihilating. The Soviet Union would cede everything west of the Volga River. Ukraine, Belorussia, the Baltic states, the Caucasus, all would become German territory or satellites. The remaining Soviet state, reduced to Siberia and Central Asia, would survive as a subordinate power, providing raw materials to German industry. Stalin signed. The alternative was complete destruction. By the summer of 1943, the war in Europe was over. Hitler controlled everything from the Atlantic to the Volga, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. 150 million people lived under direct German rule. Another 100 million lived in puppet states or client kingdoms. The Holocaust, operating without distraction or opposition, proceeded with industrial efficiency. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, the death camps worked around the clock. By the war's end, the Nazis had murdered not 6 million Jews, but 9 million, plus millions of Slavs, Roma, disabled people, and political prisoners. The scale of the atrocity was so vast that the world, when it finally learned the truth, couldn't process it. Britain watched from across the Channel, trading with the new German Empire, trying not to look too closely at what was happening in the East. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. British newspapers, censored and compliant, printed stories about German economic miracles and European unity. But sailors returning from Baltic ports whispered about trains packed with human cargo. Intelligence officers compiled reports about massive killing operations. The BBC, once the voice of truth, broadcast only what Halifax's government permitted. The Britain that had stood for something, for democracy, for civilization, for resistance to tyranny, had become a collaborator by omission. In 1944, Churchill died. His heart, weakened by decades of cigars and whiskey and stress, finally gave out. He was 70 years old. His funeral was private, attended by family and a handful of old political allies. The newspapers barely covered it. Churchill had become inconvenient, a reminder of a choice Britain had made and now needed to forget. But some Britons couldn't forget. A resistance movement emerged, led by former military officers and young people who had come of age during the peace and found it intolerable. They printed underground newspapers with names like The Last Stand and British Freedom. They sabotaged factories producing goods for Germany. They helped refugees escape from occupied Europe. The government, now openly authoritarian, hunted them relentlessly. Mosley's security forces, working closely with the Gestapo, made arrests. People disappeared. By 1945, Britain was barely recognizable. It remained technically independent. It had its parliament, its king, its empire. But independence without moral authority is just isolation. The empire began to fracture. India, disgusted by Britain's accommodation with fascism, accelerated its independence movement. Gandhi, in one of his last speeches before his assassination by a Hindu extremist, said that Britain had lost the right to rule not just India, but itself. Canada and Australia maintained formal ties, but increasingly looked to America for leadership. The Commonwealth, once a symbol of British global influence, became an empty shell. In the Pacific, America ground toward victory against Japan. The battles of Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, all unfolded roughly as they had in our timeline. But without a European theater, America poured its full industrial might into the Pacific War. The atomic bomb, developed in the Manhattan Project, was completed by July 1945. Truman, now president after Roosevelt's death, authorized its use without hesitation. Hiroshima and Nagasaki burned. Japan surrendered on August 15th. America emerged from the war as a superpower, but a frustrated one. It had defeated Japan, but had failed to prevent the subjugation of Europe. The Atlantic had become a barrier between American democracy and German totalitarianism. Truman, in his first address to a joint session of Congress after Japan's surrender, spoke bluntly. "We have won our war, but Europe has lost its soul, and Britain has lost its way." The Cold War, when it came, was not between America and the Soviet Union. It was between America and Germany. The rump Soviet state, devastated and reduced, became a German client, supplying oil and minerals in exchange for industrial goods and protection from Chinese expansion. Stalin, old and paranoid, survived until 1953, presiding over a broken remnant of his revolutionary dreams. Germany and America never fought directly. The atomic bomb, possessed by America and soon developed by Germany, made direct conflict unthinkable. Instead, they competed through proxies, through economics, through espionage. South America became a battleground. Africa was carved into spheres of influence. The Middle East, with its oil reserves, became a permanent crisis zone. Britain drifted in the middle, nominally neutral, practically irrelevant. Halifax died in 1959, still insisting he had made the only possible choice. His successors tried to rebuild Britain's moral credibility, but the stain wouldn't wash out. The Britain of Churchill and Shakespeare and Magna Carta had been replaced by the Britain of collaboration and complicity. In 1963, on the 20th anniversary of the Treaty of Stockholm that had ended the German-Soviet War, a journalist in occupied Warsaw managed to smuggle a document to the West. It was a detailed accounting, compiled by survivors and resistance historians, of the Nazi genocide. The numbers were staggering, the methods described in clinical detail. The document ended with a single question. Where was Britain? The question echoed. Where had Britain been when millions were being murdered? Where had Britain been when civilization was collapsing? The answer was unavoidable. Britain had been at peace, trading with the murderers, looking away from the crimes because acknowledging them would require action, and action would require courage. By the 1970s, a new generation of Britons, born after the peace, began asking harder questions. Why had their parents' generation surrendered? What had been gained? The empire was gone anyway. The moral authority that had made Britain a light to the world was extinguished. In exchange for 20 years of peace, Britain had traded its soul. Some historians argued that Halifax had been right in purely practical terms, that Britain would have lost if it had fought in 1940, that the peace saved British lives. Others countered that some things are worth fighting for even in the face of certain defeat, that nations are not defined by their survival, but by their choices. The debate never ended because the question it posed was eternal. Is it better to resist evil and lose, or to accommodate evil and survive? Britain had chosen survival. It discovered that survival without honor is just a slower form of death. And across the Channel, in the monuments and museums of the Greater German Reich, the regime that had murdered tens of millions and enslaved a continent displayed its power and proclaimed its permanence. Hitler died in 1962, elderly and triumphant, confident his thousand-year Reich would endure. His successors, bureaucrats and technocrats rather than ideological fanatics, maintained the system while slowly letting its revolutionary fervor fade into mere oppression. The world that emerged from Britain's peace was not the world of nuclear apocalypse and total war that many had feared in 1940. It was something worse, a world where evil had won, where justice had failed, and where the good people who might have fought had instead chosen not to. In the end, Britain discovered what Churchill had tried to tell them in that cabinet room in May 1940, that some prices are too high even for peace, that some enemies cannot be accommodated, and that nations which surrender tamely are truly finished, not destroyed but diminished into irrelevance, haunted forever by what they might have been if only they had found the courage to fight. The lights stayed on in London, but they illuminated only shadows.